These are the rules of war. They define what war crimes there are, and I must admit I had no clue they existed before making this video. And it might sound strange to have rules in war, but the further I dug into these rules of war, the more surprised I got and the weirder things became. As it turns out, there are more rules than the ones on screen right now. But most importantly, I also found out why they exist and lastly, who enforces them. See, it's not as straightforward as having a simple rulebook with clearly laid out rules and with the consequences of committing a war crime specifically worded, or who is to even enforce them. But you're probably wondering, like I was, what a war crime even is. But first, this video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations World War III, a really cool military-themed strategy game set in the late 20th and early 21st century, fielding present-day and highly modern battlefield technology. At the core of this game, you'll find an exciting real-time combat system placing players in control of an existing nation and its army, pitting them against other gamers in a struggle for world domination. Units are moved across the map in real time, often taking hours to fulfill their assigned mission goals, allowing for a very deep level of strategic planning and integrated tactical execution. A game round usually takes weeks to complete to ensure economic efficiency and a technological edge over one's opponents. Each nation must be carefully managed and developed. Researching new units while building the required infrastructure is the key to winning the game. After all, modern war is about logistics as much as combat tactics. Forming lasting alliances or short-lived coalitions is an essential part of the modern military environment. Accordingly, Conflict of Nations allows players to go from cooperative clans and teams in an all-out effort to conquer set objectives through the combined force of arms. And if you click the link in the description, you can get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free, but the offer only lasts 30 days. So sign up to Conflict of Nations World War III today. Thanks again to Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video. On March 16th, 2022, during the opening days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces broke the law of war by bombing the Mariupol theater, which was serving as an air raid shelter for civilians. As many as 600 people died in the bombing, and the event was quickly labeled a war crime. So let me explain what that is. War crimes, like any other crime, are a violation of laws, in this case the laws of war. The term laws of war may sound strange, since war itself breaks international norms like respecting country borders, but has existed since the mid-19th century. It was Swiss humanitarian Henry Dunant who pioneered the cause of international humanitarian law when witnessing the horrors of the Battle of Solferino in the Second Italian War of Independence, where soldiers were left dying in the battlefield without any assistance. This experience drove him to co-found the International Committee of the Red Cross, which would eventually lead to the signing of the First Geneva Convention. The convention signatures would allow volunteers from the organization access to collect any wounded soldier from either side of the conflict and give them aid. The First Geneva Convention was the signing of what would eventually become a set of 4 treaties leading to the Geneva Convention as we know today. A set of international humanitarian laws that seek to protect civilians, prisoners of war, and other non-combatants, while allowing states to engage in conflict. Basically, it clearly defines who you can kill and cannot kill in war. Still, there are many other documents, some even going as far back as the Christian Bible, that define norms for what you can and cannot do in a conflict. So, what are the actual rules of war? Are there actually guidelines of what you can and cannot do? Alright, so according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the rules of war boil down to 3 principles: distinction, proportionality, and precautions. I know it sounds like legal jargon, so let me explain what that means. Firstly, we have the principle of distinction, which basically means that militaries must always distinguish between civilians and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives. While attacks against military objectives like soldiers, bases, or airfields are allowed, indiscriminate attacks that strike civilians or civilian objects, or use cluster bombs for that matter, or landmines, is forbidden. The reason is that cluster bombs and mines can often injure or kill civilians, and in the case of landmines, even decades after the end of a conflict. However, this is easier said than done. Currently, there are over 50 million landmines stockpiled around the world, and over 100 million active mines in places like Egypt, Angola, Iraq, and Cambodia. But moving on to the second principle, proportionality, that states that militaries must make sure that the quote harm caused to civilians or civilian property is not excessive in relation to direct military advantage expected by an attack on a legitimate military objective, quote end. This is worrying as it could make military objectives more important than civilian life and property. In war, that means property can be attacked with civilian casualties so long as the military thinks the overall objectives are important enough. As abandoned buildings like schools or hospitals can be used as vantage points, they therefore may be bombed. After the conflict, this leaves civilians with heavily damaged or destroyed infrastructure, which could justify shelling an entire city hosting prime military targets or simply during urban warfare. While the principle of proportionality doesn't necessarily contradict distinction, it seems to take away some protections for civilians and leaves some room for attacking armies to argue large civilian losses after a battle. This leads us to the third principle, the principle of precaution, that requires military operations to constantly take precautions in sparing the civilian population and their property. This may sound a little similar to the second principle, but the difference is that while the second principle sort of allows civilian infrastructure to be targeted, the third principle means verifying that targets are in fact military objectives as much as possible, like using satellite imagery and other reconnaissance. It also means cancelling or suspending an attack after discovering the target is not a military objective, or at least giving advance warning of attacks that may affect the civilian population. Once an area is under the attacking military's control, the principle dictates that the conquering army must take additional precautions to protect the civilian population and civilian objects from the consequences of the attack, including caring for the wounded and maintaining infrastructure, as well as protecting civilian life and property from the horrors of war. While these principles try to reduce civilian casualties as much as possible, there is definitely a lot of room for error and interpretation, with often the most vulnerable caught in the middle. In trying to reduce these deaths, there has been a rise in the use of military technology like unmanned aerial vehicles, which can fly undetected for weeks, tracking suitable locations before dropping their payloads on its intended targets. While the idea of drone warfare might seem logical in a conflict where intelligence, surveillance, and minimal non-combatant deaths are primary goals, some claim that drone use is a slippery slope. According to Human Rights Watch, drones are the precursor to fully autonomous weapons, also known as killer robots. These robots raise serious moral and legal questions because they can select and engage their targets without meaningful human control. But using technology in warfare is not the only problem with the rules of war. Dr. Sean McFate, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank, says that the fundamental nature of war is changing and the rules are now outdated, and we need to usher in new rules to address these looming issues. In his book, The New Rules of War, McFate predicts how the conflicts of the future will be fought. Conflicts will be more low-key, regional, or internal, and thus appearing more criminal in organization. We can see examples in the cartel wars in Mexico or stateless organizations whose causes are more ideological than strategic, like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. McFate goes further, saying that warfare is becoming both too technical, too commercial with the rise of mercenaries, and less about two countries. This means the rules of war will become more difficult to uphold and essentially impossible to enforce. I mean, a good example is Prime Minister of Ukraine, Denis Shmyhal, who has accused Russia of over 40,000 war crimes since the start of the war. Now, who's responsible to go through all those, and more importantly, who's responsible for holding Russia accountable if they are found guilty in multiple of these war crimes? Well, that's a bit of a grey zone. Now sure, the international human rights groups and the International Criminal Court are investigating these claims, but what happens if Russia is found guilty in performing war crimes? Well, if a country is believed to have committed a war crime during conflict, the case is handled by the International Crime Court, otherwise known as the ICC, which will investigate the matter and provide punishment where appropriate. The ICC is located in The Hague, right here in the Netherlands, and is the only permanent international court with jurisdiction to prosecute for international crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The court began operations in July 2002, and so far, 45 individuals have been indicted by the court. These include Ugandan rebel leader Joseph Kony, President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, and Libyan head of state Muammar Gaddafi. Currently, 2 people are serving long-term prison sentences for crimes tried by the ICC, Thomas Ubanga and Germain Katanga. In 2006, Thomas Ubanga received 14 years of imprisonment for the war crime of conscripting and enlisting children under the age of 15 and using them to actively participate in hostilities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in 2014, Germain Katanga was convicted by the ICC on 5 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity as an accessory to the February 2003 massacre in the village of Bogoro. He is serving a 12-year sentence. So this leaves the question, what about Putin? Well, this is where it gets pretty complicated because of veto. See, the institutions that are supposed to prevent war from happening are failing to meet modern challenges. For example, the 5 veto-holding permanent members of the Security Council, the US, China, Russia, the UK, and France, must vote unanimously to call for an investigation, refer a case to trial, threaten sanctions, or propose another motion. But all too often, one or more of these countries has a vested interest in the conflict in question, the war in Ukraine being a perfect example. And since it wouldn't make sense for Russia to vote for an investigation into their war crimes, it's unlikely that Putin will get a prison sentence, like Germain Katanga or Thomas Ubanga did. But I guess only the future will tell how this turns out. Also, remember to click the link in the description to choose your country and fight your way to victory in Conflict of Nations, a free online PvP strategy game happening in modern global warfare, where you choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. That's it for this video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.